The doctor's words still echoed in my mind as I sat in my kitchen that Tuesday morning, watching the steam rise from my coffee cup like prayers I couldn't quite form. Progressive neurological condition, he had said, as if those clinical words could somehow soften the reality that my body was slowly betraying me. My left hand trembled slightly as I reached for the sugar, a reminder that some battles we fight are invisible to everyone else. I had called Daniel immediately after the appointment, needing to hear my son's voice, to feel connected to the family I had built with such careful love over 38 years. But when I tried to explain what the doctor had told me, my words came out slower than usual, slightly slurred, a symptom that had been developing gradually but was now impossible to ignore. "Mom, maybe you should consider, well, maybe it's time to think about making some arrangements," Daniel had said, his voice carrying a strange eagerness that I tried to dismiss as concern. You know, legal things. Just in case. Just in case. As if I were already gone. Now, 3 weeks later, I understood what he meant by arrangements. The realization came not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the simple act of walking past his old bedroom, now his home office, where he worked remotely most days. The door was slightly ajar, and his voice drifted out with the confidence of someone who believed he was speaking privately. "The neurological condition is progressing faster than we expected," I heard him say, and my heart lurched with fear before I realized he wasn't talking to a doctor. "Her speech is definitely affected, and sometimes she seems confused about simple things. I think we need to move quickly on the conservatorship paperwork." Conservatorship. The word hit me like cold water, washing away any illusion I still held about my son's motivations. I pressed myself against the hallway wall, my trembling hand covering my mouth to muffle any sound that might escape. "I know it seems aggressive," Daniel continued, "but honestly, she's not capable of managing her affairs anymore. And frankly, I've been taking care of everything for months already. It's really just making it official." The lawyer's voice was too muted for me to understand, but Daniel's responses painted a clear picture of a conversation that had been happening without my knowledge, about my life, my future, my rights. "The house alone is worth almost $400,000, he said, and I could hear papers rustling. Plus her retirement accounts, the life insurance policy. Look, I'm not trying to be mercenary here, but I've put my own life on hold to take care of her. I moved back home. I handle all her appointments. I drive her everywhere. This is really about protecting what she's worked for, protecting what I had worked for, by taking it away from me while I was still alive to see it happen." I made it back to my room somehow, my legs unsteady not from my condition but from the shock of discovering that my own son, the boy I had rocked through nightmares, cheered through baseball games, supported through college and his difficult divorce, saw my illness not as something to face together, but as an opportunity to claim an inheritance he apparently felt he deserved. That evening at dinner, Daniel was unusually attentive, asking about my day, refilling my water glass before I could ask, cutting my food into smaller pieces with the kind of solicitous care that now felt like performance rather than love. "You seem tired, Mom," he said, reaching over to pat my hand. "Are you having trouble keeping track of things? I noticed you forgot to take your morning medication yesterday." I had not forgotten my medication. I had deliberately taken it early, before he woke up, because I had grown tired of his hovering presence during such private moments. But now I understood why he monitored these small details so carefully. Each forgotten task, each slowed response, each stumbled word became evidence in whatever case he was building against my competence. "I'm managing fine," I said carefully, testing how my words sounded. They came out clearly, deliberately, but I could see him watching my mouth as I spoke, cataloging any hesitation. "Of course you are," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But you know, there's no shame in accepting help when you need it. That's what family is for. Family." The word felt different now, weighted with implications I was only beginning to understand. Later that night, after Daniel had gone out with friends, something he did most evenings despite his claims about putting his life on hold to care for me, I sat alone in the living room where I had raised him. The walls were covered with photographs that told the story of a life built around love and sacrifice. Daniel's first steps, his graduation from high school, the day he got his first job, Christmas mornings when he was small enough to believe in magic. In every photograph, I was there, not just present, but central. The mother who had worked 2 jobs to afford his college tuition, who had taken out a second mortgage to help him buy his first house, who had welcomed him back home without question when his marriage ended and he needed time to rebuild his life. I had given him everything I had to give, freely and without expectation of repayment, but apparently he kept a different kind of accounting. I pulled out my phone and started to dial my sister Margaret, needing to talk to someone who had known me before my words became unreliable, someone who would listen to my fears without immediately suggesting I was imagining things. But as I held the phone, I realized I didn't know how to explain what was happening. How do you tell someone that your own child is systematically planning to declare you incompetent? How do you voice the suspicion that every kindness is being calculated, every weakness documented? Instead, I set the phone aside and walked to my bedroom window, looking out at the neighborhood where I had lived for 25 years. My neighbors were settling in for the night, their windows glowing with the warm light of families who still trusted each other, who still believed that love meant protection rather than possession. If you like emotional stories that touch your heart, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here who understand that family bonds should be built on love, not opportunity. And tell me, from which city are you watching? I'd love to know I'm not alone in believing that dignity should never be negotiable, no matter what challenges we face. Tomorrow, I would begin to understand just how carefully Daniel had been laying the groundwork for what he called protection, but what felt more like a carefully orchestrated disappearance of everything I had worked to build. But tonight, in the quiet of my own home, I still believed that love could overcome calculation, that family meant something more than legal arrangements and financial inheritance. How wrong I was about to discover I had been. The changes started small, so subtle that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. Daniel began intercepting my mail, sorting through it at the kitchen counter each morning while I made breakfast. "Just helping you stay organized, Mom," he would say, setting aside what he deemed important and discarding what he called junk. But I noticed that letters from my bank disappeared into his pile, along with statements from my investment accounts and correspondence from my insurance company. When I asked about them, he would wave his hand dismissively and say, "I've got it handled. You don't need to worry about that stuff anymore." The phrase, "you don't need to worry," became his constant refrain, applied to everything from scheduling my doctor appointments to deciding which groceries we needed. I found myself being gently but firmly excluded from decisions about my own life, as if my diagnosis had somehow erased my ability to make simple choices about what to eat for lunch or which television program to watch. "I think we should cancel your book club," Daniel announced one Thursday morning, not asking for my opinion, but informing me of a decision he had apparently already made. "All that driving back and forth, it's not safe anymore. And honestly, Mom, some of those women can be pretty demanding. You don't need that kind of stress right now." My book club had been meeting for 12 years. These women had become some of my closest friends, sharing not just literature, but the intimate details of our lives as we navigated aging parents, difficult marriages, and children who sometimes disappointed us. The monthly meetings at the library were among the few purely enjoyable things left in my increasingly circumscribed world. "I enjoy those meetings," I protested, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tremor that had begun affecting my speech more noticeably. "And I'm perfectly capable of driving 6 blocks to the library." "Are you, though?" Daniel asked, his tone gentle but patronizing. "Yesterday you couldn't remember where you put your car keys. Last week you got confused about what day your appointment was. I'm not trying to be mean, Mom, but maybe it's time to be honest about your limitations." His words stung because they contained just enough truth to make me doubt myself. I had been more forgetful lately, and my keys did seem to migrate to places I didn't remember putting them. But forgetting where I placed my keys wasn't the same as forgetting how to drive, and missing one appointment didn't mean I was incompetent to manage my social calendar. Still, arguing felt exhausting, and Daniel had a way of making my protests sound like the complaints of someone who lacked insight into her own condition. It was easier to acquiesce, to let him make the call canceling my participation in the book club, even as I felt another small piece of my independence slip away. The pattern repeated itself across every aspect of my daily routine. My longtime hairdresser was deemed too expensive and replaced with someone Daniel found who charged half the price and did twice the damage to my confidence. My weekly grocery shopping trips became joint expeditions where Daniel guided the cart and made most of the selections, explaining that I was more vulnerable to impulsive purchases and needed help sticking to a sensible budget. Even my clothing choices came under his gentle but persistent criticism. Maybe something a little more practical, Mom? He would suggest when I reached for a dress I had always loved. You don't want to look like you're trying too hard. At your age, comfort should be the priority. At my age. As if turning 71 had somehow disqualified me from wanting to look attractive, from taking pleasure in colors and fabrics that made me feel like myself rather than a patient to be managed. But the most insidious change was how Daniel had begun speaking about me to others. When my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, stopped by to check on me, I listened from the kitchen as Daniel explained my condition in tones of exaggerated concern. "She's really struggling," he told her, his voice carrying just far enough for me to hear clearly. "Some days she doesn't even recognize that she's repeated the same story 3 times. And the confusion about medications, well, let's just say I'm grateful I moved back home when I did. I don't think she should be living alone anymore, but you know how stubborn she can be about admitting she needs help." I had not repeated any story 3 times. I had never been confused about my medications. And I was managing perfectly well living in the house I had called home for over 2 decades. But Mrs. Peterson nodded sympathetically, glancing toward the kitchen where I stood with what I now recognized as pity rather than concern. "You're such a good son," she told him. "Not everyone would sacrifice their own life to take care of a parent like this. Sacrifice his own life." As if caring for the woman who had raised him was some extraordinary act of charity rather than the natural reciprocity that families should offer each other. As if I had become a burden rather than a mother who still had value and dignity despite a medical condition that made some tasks more challenging. After Mrs. Peterson left, I confronted Daniel about his conversation. "I don't repeat stories," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the anger building in my chest. "And I'm not confused about my medications. Why would you tell her things that aren't true?" Daniel's expression shifted into what I was beginning to recognize as his patient caregiver face, the look of someone dealing with a difficult and unreasonable patient. "Mom, you did tell her the same story about your doctor's appointment twice yesterday. I know you don't remember doing it, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. The lack of insight into your own symptoms is part of the condition." Lack of insight. Another clinical phrase that made my reality sound like a delusion. My protests like symptoms to be managed rather than valid concerns to be addressed. "I think you're exaggerating my symptoms," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could hear how they sounded, exactly like what someone with lack of insight would say. "I'm not exaggerating anything," Daniel replied, and for just a moment, his mask of concern slipped enough for me to see something colder underneath. "I'm documenting everything, Mom, for your own protection. Someday you'll thank me for keeping track of these things when you can't remember them yourself. Documenting everything." The phrase sent a chill through me as I realized that our daily conversations, my small forgetful moments, my occasional struggles with words, everything was being cataloged and stored away for some future purpose I was only beginning to understand. That evening, I called my sister Margaret, needing to hear a voice that knew me as more than a collection of symptoms to be managed. But when I tried to explain my growing concerns about Daniel's behavior, I could hear the hesitation in her response. "Elena, honey, you know how much I love you," Margaret said carefully. "But Daniel called me last week. He's really worried about you. He says you're becoming paranoid, suspicious of people who are trying to help. Maybe you should listen to him. He lives with you every day. He can see things that the rest of us might miss." Daniel had called her. Of course he had. He was systematically reaching out to everyone in my life, planting seeds of concern about my mental state, preparing them to accept his version of my reality rather than mine. "I'm not paranoid," I said, but I could hear how defensive I sounded, how exactly my protest matched what someone who was becoming paranoid might say. "I know you don't think you are," Margaret replied gently, "but that's the thing about these conditions, isn't it? Sometimes the person experiencing them is the last to recognize how serious things have become." After I hung up the phone, I sat in the gathering darkness of my living room, understanding with painful clarity that Daniel had been more thorough than I had realized. He wasn't just planning to take control of my life. He was systematically destroying my credibility with everyone who might question his authority to do so. Every person who might have served as my advocate had been carefully prepared to see my resistance as evidence of my decline rather than proof of his manipulation. My complaints would be dismissed as symptoms, my protests interpreted as lack of insight, my anger viewed as confirmation that I was no longer capable of making rational decisions about my own welfare. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt truly afraid, not of my medical condition, but of my own son. I decided to fight back with kindness, believing that if I could prove my competence through small acts of care and capability, Daniel would remember who I had always been to him. I began waking earlier to prepare his favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, the kind I used to make when he was small and the world felt manageable. But when I presented the plate to him that first morning, he looked at the pancakes with what seemed like genuine concern rather than appreciation. "Mom, did you remember to turn off the stove?" he asked, rushing to the kitchen to check. "And look, you've got batter all over your shirt. Maybe cooking isn't the best idea right now." I looked down at my blouse, seeing only a small spot near the hem, the kind of minor mess that any cook might make. But Daniel photographed it with his phone, explaining gently that he wanted to keep track of these incidents for my medical team. Every gesture of independence became evidence of decline. When I attempted to do my own laundry, he found fault with how I had sorted the colors. When I tried to balance my checkbook, he pointed out a small arithmetic error and suggested that numbers were becoming challenging for me. When I spent an afternoon organizing my recipe box, something I had always found soothing, he expressed concern that I was becoming obsessive about organizing, and wondered aloud whether this might be a symptom of anxiety related to my condition. The most crushing moment came on a Tuesday afternoon when my granddaughter Emma called to chat. She was 22, finishing her final year of college, and had always been my special confidant. We used to talk for hours about her studies, her boyfriend troubles, her dreams of becoming a teacher like I had been before Daniel was born. But this conversation felt different from the moment she said hello. Her voice carried a careful quality, the tone people use when speaking to someone they believe might be fragile or confused. "Hi, Grandma," she said slowly, pronouncing each word with exaggerated clarity. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm wonderful, sweetheart," I replied, genuinely happy to hear from her. "Tell me about your classes. Weren't you starting that student teaching placement this month?" There was a pause, longer than natural conversation required, before Emma responded, "Grandma, I told you about that last week, remember? And the week before that? I've been student teaching since February." My heart sank as I realized that Daniel had been sharing his concerns about my memory with Emma too, but I was certain I remembered our previous conversations correctly. We had talked about her nervousness before starting the placement, her excitement about working with elementary school children, her mentor teacher who reminded her of her third-grade teacher from years ago. "Of course I remember," I said carefully. "I was asking how it's going now that you've been doing it for a while." Another pause. "Oh," Emma said, and I could hear her confusion. "Dad said you've been having trouble following conversations and keeping track of time. He said I should be patient if you ask the same questions over and over." Dad. She meant Daniel, of course. My son had become dad in conversations about my mental state, the responsible adult managing a situation that required patience and understanding. I had become the confused elderly woman who needed to be handled gently, spoken to slowly, forgiven for repetitive questions I apparently didn't remember asking. "Emma, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I think there might be some confusion about how my condition is affecting me. I'm managing quite well, and my memory is still very good for most things." "Grandma," Emma said, and now her voice carried the same gentle, patronizing tone that Daniel had perfected. "That's exactly what Dad said you would say. He explained that people with your condition often don't realize how much it's affecting them. That's why it's so important for family to help keep track of things." After we hung up, I sat staring at the phone in my lap, understanding with devastating clarity that Daniel had successfully poisoned even this relationship, perhaps the most precious one remaining in my life. Emma, who had always seen me as wise and capable, now viewed me as a symptomatic patient who lacked insight into her own decline. I decided to prove my competence through action rather than words. That weekend, I spent hours in my garden, weeding flower beds and planting the spring bulbs I had been looking forward to all winter. Gardening had always been my sanctuary, the place where I felt most connected to life and growth and the patient rhythms of seasons passing. But when Daniel found me there, kneeling in the soft soil with dirt under my fingernails and sweat on my forehead, he didn't see evidence of my continued capability. Instead, he saw another incident to document. "Mom, what are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice sharp with alarm. "You've been out here for hours. Do you know what time it is? Have you had lunch?" I had been gardening for perhaps 90 minutes, and I had eaten a perfectly adequate lunch before coming outside. But Daniel was already taking pictures of my dirt-stained clothes, my slightly disheveled hair, the gardening tools scattered around me, and what he apparently viewed as evidence of confusion rather than normal work in progress. "I'm planting bulbs," I said simply. "The same thing I've done every spring for 25 years in this garden. But look at yourself," he replied, showing me a photo he had just taken on his phone. "You're filthy. Your clothes are ruined. You obviously don't realize how long you've been out here or how you look." In the photograph, I saw what any reasonable person would see: a woman who had been working in her garden, looking exactly as someone should look after spending time with soil and plants and honest physical labor. But through Daniel's lens, my appearance became evidence of decline, proof that I was losing awareness of time and social appropriateness. That evening, he called someone, I couldn't tell who, and spoke in hushed, concerned tones about the gardening incident. "She was completely unaware of how she looked," I heard him say. "Covered in dirt, working obsessively for hours, no sense of time passing. When I tried to talk to her about it, she became defensive and insisted everything was normal. It's exactly what the doctor warned us about, the loss of social awareness that comes with this type of cognitive decline." Loss of social awareness. Another clinical phrase to describe what had always been one of my greatest joys, transformed into a symptom that required management and concern. The breaking point came the following week, when Daniel announced that he had scheduled a meeting with an elder care attorney to discuss getting my affairs in order while I was still competent enough to participate in the process. "It's really a gift," he explained, his tone gentle but firm. "Most families have to make these decisions in crisis situations, after it's too late for the person to have any input. This way, you can still be involved in planning your own care." The phrase, "while I was still competent," hit me like a physical blow. Daniel was no longer pretending that my condition might remain stable or improve with treatment. He was operating from the assumption that my mental decline was inevitable and rapid, that whatever window of competence I currently possessed was closing quickly and needed to be utilized before it disappeared entirely. "I don't want to meet with any attorney," I said, trying to assert what should have been my absolute right to decline unwanted legal consultations about my own affairs. "Mom, that's exactly the kind of thinking that worries me," Daniel replied, pulling out his phone to make what I now realized was another documentation photo of my resistance to necessary planning. "This is exactly what the doctors meant when they talked about poor judgment becoming part of the syndrome. You're not thinking clearly about what's best for your future. Poor judgment. Resistance to necessary planning." Every legitimate objection I raised to his increasingly aggressive management of my life became another symptom to be cataloged, another proof that I was no longer capable of making rational decisions about my own welfare. That night, alone in my bedroom, I finally understood that Daniel's plan was not just to gain control of my finances or my living situation. He was systematically destroying my credibility, my relationships, and my sense of self, preparing everyone who might question his authority to view my resistance as evidence of mental incapacity rather than justified self-defense. And the most terrifying part was how reasonable he made it all sound, how each step seemed logical and caring when presented individually, even as they combined to create a comprehensive assault on my autonomy and dignity. For the first time since this ordeal began, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my rage, not at my medical condition, which I could accept and adapt to, but at my own son, who had chosen to use my vulnerability as an opportunity to claim everything I had worked my entire life to build. But they didn't know what I had kept all along, hidden away where no lawyer or conservatorship could reach it, something that would change everything once I found the courage to use it. I stopped trying to prove myself after that. What was the point of making breakfast when every dropped crumb became evidence of declining motor skills? Why tend my garden when my love for growing things could be reframed as obsessive behavior? Why call my friends when Daniel had already prepared them to interpret my voice as confused, my stories as repetitive, my concerns as paranoid delusions? Instead, I retreated into a quieter version of myself, moving through my own house like a ghost, haunting rooms that had once felt like home. I would sit at my kitchen table each morning, watching Daniel eat the cereal he had chosen from the grocery store, reading emails on his phone with the focused attention of someone managing important business affairs. My affairs, I realized, though he no longer felt the need to include me in those conversations. The house felt different now, heavy with unspoken tensions and the weight of documents I wasn't allowed to see. Daniel had converted the spare bedroom into what he called his office, though I noticed he kept the door locked and the key on his person at all times. Sometimes I would hear him in there late at night, talking in low voices on phone calls that stretched past midnight, discussing details of my life with people whose names I no longer recognized. My own routine became smaller each day. I would make my coffee in the morning, carefully cleaning up any spill before Daniel could photograph it as evidence of motor dysfunction. I would sit in my reading chair by the living room window, watching the neighborhood wake up, children walking to school, neighbors retrieving newspapers, delivery trucks bringing packages to homes where families still functioned normally. But even reading became complicated when Daniel began monitoring my book choices. "Maybe something a little lighter, Mom," he would suggest when he found me with novels that had always engaged me. "All that heavy drama might not be good for your emotional state right now. Dr. Henderson mentioned that people with your condition can become overly affected by sad or violent content." Dr. Henderson had never said any such thing, but Daniel had a way of attributing his opinions to medical authority, making disagreement seem like denial of professional expertise rather than legitimate difference of opinion. I started hiding my real books, keeping them in my bedroom and reading only approved material when Daniel was around, magazines about gardening and cooking, books of inspirational quotes, the kind of bland, cheerful content that apparently suited someone of my diminished capacity. The phone calls from friends became less frequent as word spread through my social circle that I was going through a difficult time and might not be quite myself during conversations. When my friend Dorothy called to ask why I had missed the church auxiliary meeting, I could hear the careful way she phrased her questions, the gentle tone people use with invalids. "Elena, dear, Daniel mentioned that you've been having some challenges lately," she said. "We all want to be supportive, but maybe it's better if you focus on resting instead of trying to keep up with all your old commitments." My old commitments. Activities that had given my life structure and meaning were now being framed as burdensome obligations that I was too impaired to handle. The church auxiliary, where I had served as treasurer for 8 years, where my organizational skills had been valued and my opinion sought, had apparently been told I was no longer reliable enough to participate. "I'm managing fine," I said, but I could hear how the words lacked conviction. "How do you argue against a reputation that's been carefully constructed in your absence, especially when any protest sounds exactly like what someone with poor insight would say?" Dinners became especially difficult. Daniel would prepare simple meals, soup from a can, sandwiches cut into small pieces, and watch me eat with the focused attention of someone monitoring a patient for signs of distress or confusion. "Take your time, Mom," he would say when I chewed more slowly than usual, a side effect of medication rather than cognitive decline. "There's no rush. I know swallowing can become challenging with your condition." Swallowing was not challenging. I had no difficulty eating normally prepared food. But Daniel's constant commentary made every meal feel like a medical procedure, every bite observed and evaluated for evidence of neurological deterioration that existed more in his documentation than in my actual experience. Some evenings, I would cook a full dinner for myself after Daniel went out with friends, preparing the kind of complex meal he insisted I could no longer manage safely. I would set the table properly, use my good dishes, light a candle, and eat in the kind of civilized solitude that reminded me who I had been before my diagnosis became the defining feature of my existence. But I had to clean up completely before Daniel returned, leaving no evidence that I had been cooking unsupervised. Any sign that I was still capable of preparing real food would be twisted into proof that I was taking dangerous risks, using appliances without proper awareness of safety concerns. The loneliness was the worst part. Not the physical solitude, which I had always enjoyed in small doses, but the isolation that comes from being systematically disconnected from every relationship that had given your life meaning and purpose. My own son had become a stranger who monitored my behavior for signs of decline, while claiming to act out of love and concern. Late at night, when Daniel was asleep and the house was quiet, I would walk through rooms that held 40 years of memories, photographs of birthdays and holidays, furniture chosen with care over decades, books that had shaped my thinking, artwork that reflected my taste and personality. Everything that made this space a home rather than just a building was being slowly erased as Daniel replaced my choices with his preferences, my belongings with items he deemed more appropriate for my current needs. My favorite reading lamp had been replaced with something brighter that he claimed would be easier on my eyes. My comfortable kitchen chairs had been swapped for versions with higher backs that provided better support for people with mobility issues. Even my coffee mugs had been changed to ones with larger handles that were supposedly safer for people with hand tremors. Each replacement was presented as a thoughtful accommodation for my condition, but the cumulative effect was to make me feel like a stranger in my own home, surrounded by objects chosen by someone else according to criteria I hadn't been consulted about. I began to spend more time in my bedroom, the one space Daniel hadn't completely reorganized according to his vision of what an elderly woman with neurological challenges should require. There, surrounded by photographs of my younger self and Daniel as a child, I would try to remember what it felt like to be valued for my judgment, rather than monitored for signs of its absence. The photographs told a different story than the one Daniel was constructing for legal and medical authorities. They showed a competent woman who had raised a successful son, managed a household, worked as a substitute teacher for 15 years after Daniel left home, volunteered at literacy programs, maintained friendships, traveled independently, made decisions large and small with confidence and good results. But that woman was being systematically erased, replaced in everyone's memory with a confused patient who needed protection from her own poor judgment. Daniel was rewriting the story of who I was, creating a narrative that justified whatever actions he planned to take while portraying himself as a devoted son, making difficult but necessary decisions out of love. Some nights I would call my own voicemail just to hear my voice saying my name, to remind myself that I still existed as more than a collection of symptoms to be managed. The woman on the recording sounded clear, intelligent, fully present, nothing like the declining patient Daniel described to medical professionals and family members. But even that small comfort was taken away when Daniel changed my voicemail message to one he had recorded, explaining that I was going through some health challenges and asking callers to contact him directly for any important matters. My own voice had been replaced by his interpretation of my situation, another small erasure of the person I had always been. It was during one of these long, sleepless nights that I finally admitted to myself what I had been avoiding for weeks. Daniel wasn't confused about my capabilities, and he wasn't acting out of misguided concern. He was deliberately and systematically destroying my credibility, my relationships, and my independence, because doing so served his interests in ways that had nothing to do with my welfare. The realization should have been devastating, but instead, it brought an unexpected sense of relief. For weeks, I had been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if my resistance to his increasing control was really evidence of the poor judgment he kept documenting. But now, in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, I could finally acknowledge what I had known from the beginning. I was not the confused, declining patient Daniel was portraying me to be. I was a woman whose trust had been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect me, whose vulnerabilities were being exploited by the person who should have been my strongest advocate. That was a completely different situation than the one Daniel was describing to others, and it required a completely different response. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. The clarity didn't come all at once like lightning striking. It accumulated slowly, like morning light creeping across a familiar landscape, revealing details that had always been there, but were now illuminated in ways that changed everything. I began to remember who I had been before my diagnosis became the only lens through which Daniel viewed me, before my worth became measured entirely by symptoms I might or might not be developing. I had been Elena Rodriguez before I became Elena Morrison, a young woman who spoke 3 languages fluently and earned her teaching degree despite her parents' belief that education was wasted on daughters. I had worked my way through college cleaning office buildings at night, studying between emptying trash cans and mopping floors, determined to become someone who mattered in the world. I had been 24 when I married Robert, Daniel's father, choosing him not because he offered security or status, but because he laughed at my jokes and asked my opinion about everything from politics to poetry. We had built our marriage on mutual respect, sharing household responsibilities and major decisions as equal partners who valued each other's judgment. When Robert died 8 years ago, I had handled every detail of his funeral, managed the insurance claims, navigated probate court, and reorganized my finances as a widow with the competence of someone who had been making important decisions her entire adult life. I had grieved deeply but functioned completely, proving to myself and everyone around me that I was capable of managing whatever challenges life presented. That woman, competent, decisive, resilient, still existed inside me despite Daniel's attempts to bury her under layers of medical terminology and documented incidents. She had simply been dormant, waiting for me to remember that my worth wasn't determined by my son's assessment of my capabilities. I started small, reclaiming tiny pieces of autonomy that Daniel had gradually assumed control over. When he left for his morning run, I would retrieve my mail from his carefully sorted pile, reading bank statements and insurance correspondence that he had deemed too confusing for me to handle. The numbers made perfect sense, the language was clear, and I could see exactly what he had been hiding. My accounts were being systematically drained to pay for expenses I had never authorized, legal fees to firms I had never contacted, consulting charges for services I had never requested, payment plans for insurance policies that duplicated coverage I already had. Daniel had been using my power of attorney, a document I had signed when I was in the hospital for tests, trusting him to handle bills while I recovered, to spend my money on preparations for taking complete control of my life. But more disturbing than the financial manipulation was evidence of how thoroughly he had been documenting my daily activities. In a folder marked medical documentation, I found photographs of me in my garden, detailed logs of every time I had asked a question more than once, written summaries of phone calls where I had supposedly seemed confused or repetitive. The woman in these reports bore little resemblance to my actual experience of my own life, but the documentation was so detailed, so clinically presented, that any medical or legal professional would find it convincing evidence of significant cognitive decline. Daniel hadn't just been gaslighting me. He had been creating an elaborate paper trail to support whatever legal actions he planned to take. I photographed everything with my phone, understanding instinctively that evidence of his deception might become important later. But I was careful to return each document to its exact original position, maintaining the illusion that I was the declining patient who lacked the curiosity or capability to investigate her own affairs. My sister Margaret called that afternoon, and for the first time in weeks, I listened to her words with clear understanding of what was really happening in our conversation. "Elena, honey, I'm worried about you," she said, her voice carrying the gentle condescension that had become so familiar. "Daniel says you've been asking the same questions over and over, getting confused about things that used to be simple for you. Maybe it's time to consider letting him help more with day-to-day decisions." "What questions have I been asking repeatedly?" I inquired, genuinely curious about what Daniel had told her. Margaret hesitated, clearly trying to remember specific examples. "Well, he mentioned that you keep asking about your bank accounts, even after he's explained them to you, and something about you being worried about legal papers that are perfectly normal estate planning documents." I had never asked Daniel to explain my bank accounts because I was perfectly capable of reading bank statements myself. And the legal papers I had inquired about were concerning precisely because they represented attempts to manage my estate while I was still alive and competent to make my own decisions. But Daniel had reframed my legitimate questions as evidence of confusion, my reasonable concerns as symptoms of paranoid thinking. "Margaret," I said carefully, "when was the last time you and I had a conversation where I seemed confused or repetitive to you?" Another pause, longer this time. "Well, you've always been clear when we talk. But Daniel says that's common with your condition. People can seem normal in short conversations but have problems with more complex thinking," Daniel says. Everything Margaret believed about my mental state came from Daniel's reports rather than her own observations. He had been poisoning that relationship just as systematically as he had undermined my credibility with everyone else in my life. "I'd like you to visit me," I said impulsively, "not because I need help, but because I miss spending time with my sister. Would you come for coffee this Saturday when Daniel is out?" "Of course, honey. That sounds wonderful." After we hung up, I realized I had issued my first challenge to Daniel's narrative. Margaret would see for herself whether I was the confused, repetitive patient her son had been describing, or whether something else entirely was happening in this house. I spent the rest of the week preparing for her visit, not by cleaning or cooking. My house and my abilities needed no special preparation, but by gathering my thoughts and evidence of what had been happening. I practiced explaining my situation clearly and calmly, understanding that any emotional reaction would be interpreted as further proof of mental instability. The morning of Margaret's visit, Daniel mentioned casually that he might return early from his usual Saturday activities. "Just to check on you too," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I know how these family visits can be overwhelming for people in your situation." I understood that he was planning to monitor our conversation, ready to intervene if I began to reveal information that contradicted his carefully constructed narrative about my mental state. "That's thoughtful," I replied mildly. "But Margaret and I have been having coffee together for 60 years. I think we can manage a few hours without supervision." Something flickered across Daniel's face. Surprise, perhaps, at the quiet firmness in my voice. For weeks, I had been accommodating his increasing control without significant resistance, playing the role of the declining patient who accepted others' assessments of her capabilities. This small assertion of independence was the first crack in that performance. When Margaret arrived, she hugged me with the careful gentleness people use with fragile relatives, scanning my face for signs of confusion or distress. But as we settled in the kitchen with coffee and homemade cookies, yes, I had baked them myself, despite Daniel's concerns about my using the oven unsupervised, her expression gradually shifted. "You seem really good, Elena," she said after we had talked for nearly an hour about everything from her grandchildren's school performances to the book she was reading to changes in our old neighborhood. Daniel made it sound like you were having much more serious problems. "What kind of problems did he describe?" I asked. Margaret looked uncomfortable, clearly realizing that her sister's mental clarity contradicted everything she had been told to expect. "He said you were becoming paranoid about people trying to control your money, that you were asking the same questions over and over, that you seemed confused about basic things like what day it was, or whether you had taken your medication. In the 2 hours we've been talking, have I seemed confused about anything? Have I repeated myself or asked you the same question multiple times?" "No," Margaret admitted slowly. "You've been completely yourself. Sharp as ever, actually." I pulled out copies of the documentation I had discovered in Daniel's files, showing her the photographs he had taken of me gardening, the detailed logs of my supposed memory failures, the records of expenses charged to my accounts without my knowledge. "This is what Daniel has been creating," I explained calmly. "A paper trail that makes me look incompetent, so he can justify taking control of my finances and my life. Every normal activity gets reframed as evidence of decline. Every reasonable question becomes proof of confusion." Margaret studied the documents with growing alarm, her expression shifting from concern about my mental state to anger about what was being done to me. "Elena, this is deliberate. This isn't a son worried about his mother's health. This is someone building a case." "Yes," I said simply. "Now you understand what's really been happening." We talked for another hour, and I watched Margaret's perception of the situation transform completely. She saw clearly what I had been experiencing, not a confused elderly woman requiring protection, but a competent adult being systematically undermined by someone who should have been her strongest advocate. When Daniel returned that afternoon, I greeted him with the same mild pleasantness I had maintained for weeks, but something fundamental had changed. I was no longer alone with my growing awareness of his manipulation. Someone else now understood what was really happening. Someone who could serve as witness to my actual mental state rather than the fictional version Daniel had been promoting. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I was going to stop being a victim of Daniel's scheme and start being an active participant in my own defense. The woman who had survived widowhood, raised a son, managed a household, and navigated decades of life's challenges was still here, still capable, still deserving of respect and autonomy. It was time for her to take back control of her own story. The change in my behavior was subtle enough that Daniel didn't immediately recognize it as resistance. I continued to play the role of the compliant patient, while quietly gathering information and rebuilding connections he had tried to sever. When he left for work each morning, I would spend hours on the phone, not just with Margaret, but with other family members and friends who had been fed his version of my decline. "Cousin Patricia," I said when I called my father's niece in Phoenix. "I wanted to hear your voice. Daniel mentioned that you were concerned about my health, and I thought we should talk directly." Patricia's confusion was immediate and telling. "Elena, honey, I haven't spoken to Daniel in months. What did he say I was concerned about?" Another lie. Another manufactured piece of evidence for his narrative. Daniel had been claiming that extended family members were reaching out with worries about my condition, using their supposed concerns to justify his increasing control. But when I called them directly, none of them had expressed any such worries because none of them had noticed any changes in my behavior during our occasional conversations. I began keeping my own documentation, not of symptoms and incidents, but of Daniel's lies, his financial manipulations, and the growing evidence that his concern for my welfare was entirely performative. I photographed bank statements showing unauthorized expenditures, recorded phone calls where I demonstrated perfect mental clarity, and compiled a list of everyone Daniel had lied to about my condition. But I was careful to hide this evidence in places he would never think to look. The locked office where he kept his files was only secure as long as I played the helpless woman who lacked the curiosity or capability to investigate her own situation. He had no idea that I had discovered his hiding place for the spare key, or that I regularly reviewed his documentation during his daily runs. The most damaging discovery came when I found emails between Daniel and the elder care attorney he had insisted I meet with. The correspondence revealed the full scope of his plans, not just financial control, but a move to declare me incompetent and place me in a memory care facility that would accept his assessment of my condition without independent evaluation. "The documentation you've provided clearly establishes diminished capacity," the attorney had written. "With the medical records showing neurological decline and your detailed logs of incidents, we should have no problem obtaining conservatorship. The placement at Sunset Manor can be arranged as soon as the legal paperwork is finalized." Sunset Manor. I looked up the facility online and found a cheerful website featuring photographs of elderly residents engaged in simple crafts and supervised activities. The marketing language emphasized safety and specialized care for individuals with cognitive challenges. But what I saw was a place where people disappeared, where families could store inconvenient relatives while reassuring themselves that professional caregivers were providing appropriate supervision. Daniel wasn't planning to care for me in his home, or even arrange for home care services that would allow me to maintain some independence. He was preparing to have me institutionalized, declared incompetent, and removed from any position where I could question his management of my assets or challenge his authority over my life. The timeline was accelerating. I found a calendar in his files marking important dates: the conservatorship hearing scheduled for the following month, the meeting with facility administrators, the deadline for transferring assets to accounts he could control without court oversight. He had been planning this systematically for months, long before my diagnosis had progressed to anything that would justify such drastic measures. I called my old friend Joan, who had worked as a paralegal for 30 years before retiring. Without revealing the full scope of my situation, I asked hypothetical questions about conservatorship procedures and the rights of people facing such actions. "The system is supposed to protect vulnerable adults," Joan explained, "but it can be abused by family members who present convincing evidence of incapacity. Once someone is declared incompetent, it's very difficult to regain legal rights. The person becomes essentially powerless to challenge the arrangement, even if their condition improves or the original assessment was flawed." "What kind of evidence would be convincing?" I asked. "Medical records showing cognitive decline, documented incidents of poor judgment or confusion, testimony from family members about the person's inability to manage daily activities. If the documentation is thorough enough, judges rarely question it, especially when it comes from seemingly concerned relatives." Daniel's strategy was becoming crystal clear. He had been creating exactly the kind of evidence Joan described, building a case so comprehensive that no judge would hesitate to grant him complete control over my life and finances. My protests would be dismissed as lack of insight, my resistance viewed as further proof of my incapacity. But he had made one crucial miscalculation. In his eagerness to document my supposed decline, he had created a paper trail of his own deception. The photographs, the fabricated incidents, the financial manipulations, all of it existed in writing, stored in files he had organized with the same meticulous attention to detail that would ultimately expose his fraud. That weekend, an envelope arrived in the mail addressed to me personally, marked confidential, with a return address I didn't recognize. Daniel had been intercepting my mail for weeks, but this letter had somehow bypassed his screening process, perhaps because it looked like a routine business communication, rather than something requiring his attention. Inside was a letter from a law firm I had never contacted, informing me that they had been engaged to represent my interests in the matter of the proposed conservatorship proceeding initiated by your son, Daniel Morrison. The letter explained that I had the right to independent legal representation, that I could contest the petition if I believed it was unnecessary or premature, and that I should contact their office immediately to discuss my options. I stared at the letter with growing amazement. Someone, I couldn't imagine who, had arranged for legal representation on my behalf, recognizing that I was facing a threat I might not even be aware of. The timing suggested that whoever had done this understood the urgency of my situation and had been monitoring the legal proceedings Daniel assumed I knew nothing about. The law firm's name was familiar from newspaper articles about elder abuse cases. They specialized in representing people whose families had attempted to exploit their vulnerabilities for financial gain. This wasn't a general practice attorney who might be intimidated by Daniel's documentation. This was someone who understood exactly what tactics manipulative family members used and how to counter them effectively. I called the number immediately, speaking to an attorney named Sarah Chen who asked me detailed questions about my living situation, my medical condition, and my awareness of the legal actions being taken allegedly for my benefit. "Mrs. Morrison," she said after I had explained everything I had discovered, "what you're describing is a textbook case of financial elder abuse combined with systematic manipulation designed to support a fraudulent conservatorship petition. The good news is that you're clearly competent to make your own decisions and participate in your own defense. The challenging news is that your son has been very thorough in creating documentation that could be convincing to someone who doesn't understand how these schemes operate." "Who arranged for you to contact me?" I asked. "I'm not at liberty to reveal that information yet," Sarah replied, "but I can tell you that someone who cares about your welfare became aware of the situation and wanted to ensure you had proper legal representation. We can discuss that more when we meet in person." We scheduled an appointment for the following Thursday, when Daniel would be out of town on a business trip that I now suspected was related to finalizing arrangements for my involuntary placement at Sunset Manor. The timing was perfect. I could meet with my attorney, review all the evidence I had gathered, and prepare a defense without Daniel becoming aware that his plans were being challenged. That night at dinner, Daniel was unusually talkative, discussing his upcoming trip with the enthusiasm of someone anticipating a significant achievement. "It's just a brief business meeting in Chicago," he explained, cutting my food into smaller pieces with the patronizing care that had become routine. "I hate to leave you alone, but Mrs. Peterson next door said she'd check on you. And of course you have my number if you need anything." Mrs. Peterson, who Daniel had carefully prepared to view me as a confused woman requiring supervision. Another layer of his protective web, ensuring that even my neighbors would report back to him about any unusual behavior during his absence. "I'll be fine," I assured him, maintaining the mild tone that had become my shield against his increasing control. "It's only 2 days." "I know you think you'll be fine," Daniel replied with gentle condescension, "but people with your condition don't always recognize when they're having problems. Promise me you'll call Mrs. Peterson if you feel confused about anything, or if you can't remember whether you've taken your medication." I promised, understanding that this conversation was another form of documentation, establishing that he had arranged appropriate supervision and that I had agreed to accept help if needed. Every interaction had become part of his legal strategy, every word carefully chosen to support his narrative about my incompetence. But two could play that game. "Daniel," I said, looking directly at him with the clear gaze of someone whose mind was functioning perfectly, "I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for me. Taking care of a parent with health challenges isn't easy, and I know you're making sacrifices." Something flickered across his face. Surprise at my directness, perhaps, or unease at the steady way I met his eyes. For just a moment, he seemed to see me not as a patient to be managed, but as a person who understood exactly what was happening between us. "Of course, Mom," he said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "That's what family does." That night, as Daniel packed for his trip, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of preparation drifting through the house. Phone calls to confirm appointments, the rustle of papers being organized, the quiet confidence of someone who believed his careful planning was about to pay off. But I was making preparations too, gathering evidence and allies he knew nothing about, preparing to reclaim the life he thought he had already stolen from me. The woman he had underestimated was about to remind him that competence isn't something you lose, simply because someone decides you're no longer worthy of possessing it. The storm was coming, and this time, I would not be the victim caught unprepared in its path. Daniel's flight was scheduled to leave at 6 a.m. Thursday morning, which meant he left the house in darkness, kissing my forehead with the gentle affection of a devoted son, while I pretended to be drowsy and confused about his early departure. "Remember what we talked about," he whispered, assuming I was too sleepy to focus clearly. "Mrs. Peterson will check on you, and you have her number if you need anything. Don't try to cook anything complicated while I'm gone." I mumbled something appropriately vague and watched him gather his luggage and files, including a briefcase I knew contained documents about my future institutionalization. He paused at my bedroom door, studying my face in the dim light as if trying to assess whether I was alert enough to cause problems while he was away. But I had perfected the art of appearing more impaired than I actually was, and Daniel saw what he expected to see: a confused elderly woman who would spend his absence watching television and taking naps, supervised by well-meaning neighbors who had been prepared to report any concerning behavior. The moment his car disappeared down the street, I transformed back into the competent woman I had always been. I showered, dressed in my best suit, the navy blue one I had worn to court when settling Robert's estate, and prepared for the most important meeting of my life. Sarah Chen's office was in a downtown building I remembered from my teaching days, when I used to bring my students here for field trips to see how the legal system worked. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was returning as someone fighting for my own basic rights, rather than as an educator showing children how justice was supposed to function. Sarah was younger than I had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of sharp intelligence in her eyes that made me instantly trust her judgment. She had spread Daniel's documentation across a conference table like evidence in a criminal trial, which, I was beginning to understand, was exactly what this situation represented. "Mrs. Morrison," she said after reviewing everything I had brought, "your son has created one of the most sophisticated elder abuse schemes I've encountered. He's used your medical diagnosis as cover for systematic financial exploitation, while building a legal case for conservatorship that would have been almost impossible to challenge if you hadn't discovered it in time." She showed me how Daniel had manipulated each piece of evidence, photographing me in normal situations, but describing them as evidence of confusion, documenting conversations that had never happened, creating a medical narrative that exaggerated my symptoms while ignoring my actual functioning level. "The financial abuse alone constitutes multiple felonies," Sarah continued. "He's been using your power of attorney to pay legal fees for actions taken against your interests, essentially forcing you to fund your own exploitation. But the conservatorship fraud is what makes this particularly egregious. He's been preparing to have you declared legally incompetent based on fabricated evidence. Can we stop it?" I asked. "We can do better than stop it," Sarah replied with a smile that suggested she had been looking forward to this conversation. "We can expose it completely. Your son filed his conservatorship petition believing you were unaware of the proceedings and unable to mount an effective defense. He has no idea that you've been gathering counter-evidence or that you have competent legal representation." She explained her strategy. "Rather than simply contesting the conservatorship petition, we would file criminal complaints for elder abuse, fraud, and theft. The evidence Daniel had so carefully compiled would be turned against him, demonstrating not my incapacity, but his deliberate deception. There's one more thing," Sarah said, pulling out a folder I hadn't seen before. "You asked who arranged for my representation. It was your granddaughter, Emma. Emma." The revelation hit me with stunning force, but she seemed to believe everything Daniel told her about my condition. "She was acting," Sarah explained. "Emma became suspicious when her father's descriptions of your decline didn't match her own observations during your phone calls. She started investigating on her own and discovered some of the same financial irregularities you found. She contacted our office 3 weeks ago, but we advised her to wait until we could gather more evidence before confronting the situation directly. 3 weeks ago, right around the time Emma had called and seemed to be speaking to me as if I were confused and repetitive. She hadn't been convinced by Daniel's manipulation. She had been testing whether I was actually experiencing the symptoms he was reporting. Her careful, patronizing tone had been an act designed to make Daniel believe she accepted his version of my condition, while she gathered evidence to protect me. She's been documenting her own conversations with you, Sarah continued, recording calls where you demonstrate perfect mental clarity, saving voicemails where your speech and thinking are completely normal. She's also been quietly reaching out to your friends and family members, discovering that many of Daniel's claims about their concerns were fabricated. The idea that my granddaughter had been working to protect me while I thought she had been turned against me brought tears to my eyes, the first tears I had shed since this ordeal began, but these were tears of relief and gratitude rather than despair. Emma will testify on your behalf, Sarah said. So will several of your friends who can confirm that Daniel misrepresented their views about your condition. And we have medical experts prepared to evaluate you and confirm that your cognitive function is consistent with someone managing a neurological condition appropriately, not someone requiring conservatorship. We spent the next 3 hours preparing for what Sarah called the confrontation. Daniel would return from Chicago on Friday evening, expecting to find me in the same compliant, unaware state he had left behind. Instead, he would discover that his entire scheme had been exposed and that serious legal consequences were waiting for him. The key, Sarah explained, is to let him reveal the full scope of his deception before he realizes how much trouble he's in. We want him to continue lying, to double down on his claims about your incompetence, because every false statement he makes strengthens our case. Friday evening arrived with the soft light of early spring, and I sat in my living room watching for Daniel's car with the calm anticipation of someone who had spent months being underestimated and was finally ready to correct that miscalculation. He came through the door with the breezy confidence of someone whose business trip had gone exactly as planned, kissing my cheek and asking about my 2 days alone with the patronizing concern that had become his trademark. "I missed you, Mom," he said, settling into the chair across from me with obvious satisfaction. "Mrs. Peterson said you did great. No problems at all. She mentioned you seemed a little confused about what day it was when she checked on you yesterday. But that's perfectly normal." The lie was so casual, so automatic, that I almost admired its audacity. Mrs. Peterson had not checked on me, and I had not spoken to her during his absence. But Daniel needed to maintain his documentation of my confusion, so he simply invented interactions that supported his narrative. "How was Chicago?" I asked mildly. "Productive," he replied, and something in his tone suggested this was an understatement. "I was able to finalize some important arrangements for your future care. Everything's falling into place exactly as we discussed." We had never discussed any such arrangements, but I nodded as if I understood what he was referring to. "Actually, Mom, there are some papers I need you to sign," Daniel continued, pulling out documents from his briefcase. "Just some routine updates to your healthcare directives, but the lawyers want your signature while you're still able to participate in these kinds of decisions." Still able. The phrase hung in the air like a threat, a reminder that my window of supposed competence was closing according to his timeline. He spread the papers across the coffee table, pointing to signature lines with the efficient manner of someone conducting routine business. But I had learned to read legal documents during my years as a teacher, and later as Robert's partner in managing our household finances. These weren't healthcare directives. They were agreements to voluntary placement in a residential facility, waivers of my right to contest the conservatorship, and authorizations for Daniel to make all financial decisions on my behalf. "These don't look like healthcare directives," I said calmly. Daniel's expression flickered, just for a moment, before resuming its practiced concern. "They're comprehensive documents, Mom. Healthcare, housing, financial management, all integrated to make sure everything is coordinated properly. I know they look complicated, but that's why you have me to handle the details. I'd like to read them more carefully before I sign anything," I said. "Of course," Daniel replied, but I could see tension building around his eyes. "But honestly, some of the legal language might be confusing given how things have been developing with your condition. Maybe it's better to trust that I've reviewed everything thoroughly. I think I'll have my own attorney review them," I said, still maintaining the mild tone that had served me so well over these difficult months. The silence that followed was electric with sudden tension. Daniel stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack under the pressure of this unexpected resistance. "Your attorney?" he repeated slowly. Mom, you don't have an attorney. We discussed this. I'm handling all your legal needs now. Actually, I said, reaching for the business card Sarah had given me, I've retained Sarah Chen to represent my interests. She's been very helpful in explaining my rights. I watched Daniel's face transform as the implications of my words sank in. The patient, concerned son disappeared entirely, replaced by someone I barely recognized, cold, calculating, and suddenly very angry. What rights? He asked, his voice dropping to a tone I had never heard him use before. Mom, you're not competent to retain an attorney. You can't even remember what day it is half the time. There it was. The mask finally off, the pretense abandoned. Daniel was no longer performing the role of the devoted caregiver. He was showing me exactly what he really thought of me, and exactly why he felt entitled to take control of my life. I remember perfectly what day it is, I said, my voice steady and clear. It's Friday, April 15th. It's the day you came home from Chicago expecting me to sign documents that would put me in a memory care facility and give you complete control of my finances. It's the day your scheme to defraud me ends. The word defraud hit him like a physical blow. He stood up abruptly, the legal document scattering to the floor, and for the first time in months, I saw him as he truly was, not a concerned son, but a man whose elaborate plan was collapsing around him. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice carried no conviction. You're confused. You're sick. These delusions are part of your condition. No, Daniel, I replied, standing to meet his gaze directly. The only delusion was thinking I wouldn't figure out what you were doing to me, but I know everything now, and so do the authorities. The color drained from Daniel's face as the full weight of my words settled between us. For a moment, he stood frozen in my living room, surrounded by the scattered papers that represented months of careful planning, now reduced to worthless debris on my carpet. The authorities? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah Chen has filed criminal complaints for elder abuse, fraud, and theft, I said, each word delivered with the calm precision of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The district attorney's office is very interested in your documentation, Daniel. Every photograph you took, every incident you fabricated, every lie you told about my condition, it's all evidence now. Evidence of your crimes, not my incompetence. He sank back into his chair, the confident man who had left for Chicago replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. Mom, you don't understand what you're doing. Those lawyers are taking advantage of you. They're manipulating someone who isn't thinking clearly. Even now, even with his scheme exposed and his future crumbling around him, Daniel couldn't abandon the narrative that had served him so well. I was still the confused patient in his mind, still someone whose decisions could be dismissed as symptoms rather than choices. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months, I replied. Clear enough to know that a son who loves his mother doesn't document her every moment of weakness to use against her later. Clear enough to recognize that caring for a parent doesn't include stealing her money to pay lawyers who will help you steal more. The front door opened, and Emma walked in with the purposeful stride of someone who had been waiting for this moment as eagerly as I had. Behind her came Sarah Chen, carrying a briefcase that I knew contained copies of all the evidence we had gathered. Daniel's head snapped up at their entrance, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to understanding to something approaching panic. Emma? What are you doing here? I'm here to support my grandmother, Emma said, settling beside me on the couch with natural ease. The grandmother who raised me to believe that family protects each other, not exploits each other's vulnerabilities for profit. You don't understand the situation, Daniel said, turning to his daughter with desperate intensity. Your grandmother is sick. She's being manipulated by people who want to take advantage of her condition. These lawyers are filling her head with paranoid fantasies. Emma pulled out her phone, scrolling to a recording app that showed dozens of saved files. I understand perfectly, Dad. I have hours of recorded conversations with Grandma where she demonstrates perfect mental clarity. I also have recordings of you describing symptoms she's never exhibited and claiming that family members were concerned about her when I checked with them directly, and they had no such concerns. Sarah opened her briefcase and began laying out documents with the methodical precision of someone presenting evidence in court. Mr. Morrison, you've been systematically defrauding your mother for months while building a legal case to have her declared incompetent based on fabricated evidence. We have documentation of unauthorized expenditures totaling over $40,000, forged medical reports, and witness testimony that contradicts virtually every claim you've made about her condition. Daniel looked from Sarah to Emma to me, searching our faces for some sign of uncertainty or confusion that might allow him to regain control of the situation. But we were three women who understood exactly what had been happening and had prepared ourselves thoroughly for this confrontation. The conservatorship petition has been withdrawn, Sarah continued. Your mother is represented by competent counsel, and criminal charges are being filed. You have the right to retain your own attorney, and I strongly advise you to do so. This is insane, Daniel said, standing up with sudden aggressiveness. She's my mother. I've been taking care of her. Everything I've done has been for her own protection. Protection from what? I asked quietly. From managing my own finances? From maintaining my friendships? From making my own decisions about where to live and how to spend my time? You weren't protecting me, Daniel. You were erasing me. The words hung in the air with devastating accuracy. For months, Daniel had been systematically eliminating every aspect of my identity that didn't serve his purposes: my independence, my relationships, my credibility, my autonomy. He had been preparing to erase me so completely that I would exist only as a legal ward generating income for his benefit. I want you to leave, I said, the words coming from a place of strength I had almost forgotten I possessed. Pack your belongings and find somewhere else to live. This is my house, and I don't want you in it anymore. You can't do this, Daniel protested. You need someone to take care of you. You can't manage on your own. I've been managing on my own for 8 years since your father died, I replied. I managed just fine until you decided my diagnosis was an opportunity instead of a challenge we could face together. I'll manage even better without someone documenting my every movement for evidence of incompetence. Emma stood up and moved toward her father with the calm authority of a young woman who had been forced to become an adult more quickly than she should have needed to. Dad, Grandma is giving you the chance to leave with some dignity intact. If you fight this, if you continue to claim she's incompetent, the criminal case will proceed, and everyone will know exactly what you tried to do to her. Sarah nodded in agreement. We're prepared to offer a plea agreement if you return the stolen funds and agree to stay away from your mother. But that offer has limitations, Mr. Morrison. If you persist in claiming she lacks capacity, we'll be forced to prove in court just how competent she really is, and how thoroughly you've been deceiving everyone about her condition. Daniel looked around the room one more time, perhaps hoping to find some avenue of escape or negotiation that didn't require him to acknowledge the magnitude of his betrayal, but there was none. His careful plan had been not just exposed but completely reversed. Instead of me being declared incompetent, he was facing criminal prosecution for elder abuse. Fine, he said finally, his voice hollow with defeat. But don't come crying to me when you realize you can't manage without help. Don't call me when you fall, or when you can't remember where you put things, or when the world becomes too confusing to navigate on your own. Even in surrender, he couldn't resist one final attempt to undermine my confidence, to plant seeds of doubt about my ability to function independently. But his words carried no power now because I understood them for what they were: manipulation designed to make me question my own perceptions rather than trust my actual experience. I won't call you, I said simply. If I need help, I'll ask for it from people who care about my welfare rather than my bank account. Daniel left that evening with 2 suitcases and a bitter silence that spoke volumes about his sense of entitlement to my life and assets. He had expected gratitude for his management of my affairs, appreciation for his willingness to make difficult decisions on my behalf. The possibility that I might prefer to make my own decisions, even imperfect ones, had apparently never occurred to him. After he was gone, Emma and I sat in the kitchen over cups of tea, talking honestly for the first time in months about what we had both experienced during his campaign to portray me as incompetent. I knew something was wrong when you started repeating stories in our phone calls, Emma said, but then I realized you weren't repeating them. Dad was telling me you had repeated them when you hadn't. He was creating incidents that never happened and attributing them to you. Why didn't you say something sooner? I asked. I needed proof, Emma replied with wisdom beyond her years. I knew that if I challenged him without evidence, he would just claim I was being manipulated by your supposed paranoid thinking. So I started recording our conversations and documenting what really happened versus what he claimed had happened. Sarah had stayed for dinner, and as the evening progressed, I began to understand the full scope of the legal protection that was now in place. The criminal charges would likely result in probation and restitution rather than jail time, assuming Daniel accepted the plea agreement and returned the stolen funds. More importantly, restraining orders were in place that prevented him from contacting me directly or attempting to interfere in my medical care or financial management. "What you've experienced is unfortunately common," Sarah explained. "Adult children often view their parents' assets as inheritance that should be protected, managed, or accessed according to their own judgment rather than their parents' wishes. When a medical condition is involved, they can convince themselves, and others, that taking control is an act of care rather than exploitation." Over the following weeks, my life gradually returned to rhythms I had chosen for myself rather than patterns imposed by someone else's assessment of my limitations. I resumed my book club, whose members welcomed me back with questions about my health, but no assumptions about my capabilities. I returned to my garden, spending hours among plants and soil without anyone photographing me as evidence of confusion or poor self-care. Most importantly, I rebuilt relationships with friends and family members who had been influenced by Daniel's portrayal of my decline. The conversations were sometimes awkward. People had to reconcile their memories of my competence with months of being told I was confused and declining rapidly, but they were also healing, as I demonstrated through consistent interaction that reports of my mental deterioration had been greatly exaggerated. Margaret visited regularly, bringing with her a mixture of guilt about believing Daniel's lies and relief about my actual condition. "I should have trusted my own observations," she said during one of our coffee conversations. "Every time we talked, you seemed perfectly fine, but he was so convincing about what was happening when I wasn't around." "He was convincing because he had an agenda," I replied, "and because people want to trust that children have their parents' best interests at heart. The idea that a son would fabricate evidence of his mother's incompetence is so disturbing that it's easier to believe the mother is actually declining." 6 months later, I received a letter from Daniel, not directly, but through Sarah, who reviewed all communications to ensure they didn't constitute harassment or attempts to manipulate me into dropping the criminal charges. The letter was brief and formal, acknowledging that he had made errors in judgment regarding my care and expressing regret for any distress his actions had caused. It was not an apology. It was a legal document designed to satisfy the requirements of his plea agreement while admitting as little actual wrongdoing as possible. There was no acknowledgement of the months of systematic emotional abuse, no recognition that he had tried to steal my autonomy along with my money, no understanding that his errors in judgment had been a calculated campaign to destroy my credibility and independence. I had Emma read the letter to me, not because my vision or comprehension had declined, but because I wanted to hear his words filtered through the voice of someone who loved me genuinely rather than strategically. When she finished, we sat in comfortable silence in my living room, surrounded by the photographs and furniture and accumulated comforts of a life I had nearly lost to someone else's greed. "Are you disappointed that he couldn't really apologize?" Emma asked. "No," I said, surprising myself with how true that felt. An apology would require him to understand what he did wrong, and I don't think he's capable of that level of self-reflection. He still believes he was protecting me from myself, that my resistance to his control was evidence of my incompetence rather than proof of my strength. Emma nodded thoughtfully. "So what happens now?" "Now," I said, settling back into my favorite chair with a book I had chosen for myself, "I continue being exactly who I've always been, a competent woman managing a neurological condition with dignity and independence. The only difference is that now I remember not to trust people just because they're family, and to listen to my own voice when others try to tell me what I'm capable of. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth. The quiet strength that sustained me through Daniel's campaign of manipulation proved more powerful than all his documentation and false concern. In the end, the woman he tried to erase remained standing in her own home, surrounded by people who loved her for who she was rather than what she possessed. The rest, as they say, was peace.